Hey everyone. Small group, that's good. Then we can do plenty of questions. What I'm going to talk to you about is the evolution of the Startersquad Kanban flow. The background of this is that I've started a community, a distributed community of software developers. We work only for startups and we do plenty of projects because startup projects are quite small. In these projects, we use something that is like Kanban. It's not Kanban by the book. Like you should never do Kanban by the book or Scrum by the book because then you get way too much overhead. But what we do is something that looks like Kanban, and in every project we learn things because every week we have a retrospective, and from those learnings we see evolution in the way we design our flows. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about evolution, how that works and how you can apply that to your organization maybe. And I'm also going to show you some examples of Kanban flows in different projects which are in different states of the evolution. Because at the end of the project, that's a certain date, you have a sort of snapshot of our process at that point, and then later projects have new learnings. So that could be quite interesting. Let's talk first about evolution. Always, if you talk about something, you look at Merriam-Webster and you see what the definition is, and there's actually quite a few different definitions of evolution. It happens in biology, it happens in processes, it happens with ideas, and the definition that I took out of it, which is most important for this talk, is this one. Process of continuous change from a lower, simpler, or worse, to a higher, more complex or better state. So basically it's the process of change or improvement. What's also important to understand is that evolution can be applied to species, of course, but it can also be applied to ideas. And this is, I think, very interesting. What you see happening in communities or in societies is that ideas live in one person, then they get shared with another person. When they get shared, they mutate, and they also have offsprings together. So you have crossover and mutation, like you have actually in biological evolution with ideas. And that's very interesting, applied to the Kanban flow that I'm going to show you, but also applied to other things. And basically what we have is a genetic algorithm, because we have the fitness of the idea of how a Kanban flow should work, and this fitness determines whether or not this Kanban flow idea is going to survive to the next project. And then the next project will have a slight mutation or a crossover of different ideas, and again we find out what the fitness is because the success of the project is immeasurable. And this we execute manually by community. So let's look at a couple of those states and let's see how it works. What we do is in Startersquad we use Trello for pretty much all our projects. Unless a client is really focused on a certain tool, we allow them sometimes to use Jira or another project management tool, but Trello works best for us. And this is the starting state of Trello. So this is an actual project that is running right now, which uses the default Trello setup. You see one lane to do, one lane doing, one lane done. Very simple, and that works for very simple small projects. Of course, some things are missing, and then you see that after learning about this, we find out that the to-do column is not detailed enough. So in the next phase of the evolution, we had also a backlog. So we prioritize a backlog, then we determine what we're going to do next in the next week or day or sprint, you could even call it. And we add this prioritized backlog to the flow. This seemed to work. We had better success with our projects having a backlog separated from the focused to-do column, and that's why it survived. Then you see a little bit more evolution going on, and this actually goes back to the talk that you just heard from Georgios. We have the backlog like we have the doing column, and then two columns were added, the pending pull request and the show client column. So basically what we started doing is work strictly with a tool that is called Gitflow. You should really look it up if you haven't used it yet. It's awesome. And it defines a very precise process of changing, creating pull requests, merging them into your develop branch, and then finally releasing them. So what we did is we started with the GitHub model that doesn't have a separate develop branch and a separate master branch, but just pull requests against master, which actually most open source projects that you probably saw are using. And what we did is when we merge the pull request, we have a list of things that were merged, and those need to be shown to the client so that he can accept them and we can actually mark them as done. Because if we merge a pull request and the client is not happy with the new feature, then of course we need to move back. That still makes sense, right? And then we found out that the process is a little bit more complicated than that, and we started adding more. It gets harder and harder to read. That's intentional. I don't want you to copy this exactly to your project. I just want you to understand the evolutionary aspect of it and try to replicate that in your organization. Your process is probably going to look different than this one. So what happened, we had the to-do or backlog column. You see that this is actually a different strand of the evolution because the backlog is not there yet, but the PR and done and released column are different from the other one. So this one focuses more on the release process, and it says, okay, if a client says that this feature is done, we still need to put it on the production environment. So we need to have a different stage for that. And that's where actually the full application of the Git flow model happened. So we have a different branch, which is the develop branch. If we create a pull request on that, we mark it as done. But then we show it to the client, we make a release, and we move it to the production environment. This is the final thing we came to, which is, I think, working quite well. And what I want to do with you is go over each of the steps, explain them to you, and explain to you how we got to them, because there's actually quite a few details there. It's not going to take very long, but let's have a look. So first of all, we start with idea grooming column. We don't know yet if we should put something on the backlog, but there are maybe users of the product, or there is developers in the community, or there's other stakeholders that want something to happen, and then we want to start tracking that feature or that idea. Once it is ready enough to be estimated, we move it to the estimatable ready column. So the client needs to make a decision whether a certain idea is a good idea. Then he needs to work on it a little bit to describe how it's going to work exactly with the developers. What we do then actually, we already define all the test cases, and we define exactly how it's going to be demoed. So we have a demo script for it. So that makes it easier for the developers to estimate what they're going to do. From there, the developers assess how much work it is going to be and move it to estimated. Then the client again gets a chance, based on the estimations, to decide whether or not he wants this feature, because then he knows the price, right? Then when the estimated prioritized backlog is ready to pick up, we move them to this week. So we agree with the client after estimation, after prioritization, that it's going to happen in this week and that we're actually going to work on it. Again, a stage that we found out. The interesting thing is that when we didn't have this week column, this bunch of work that we agreed with the client to do after estimation, we have had actually some problems, because what could happen is that the client thinks something is a good idea, gives it high priority, the developer estimates it, and it turns out to be a lot of work. We don't go back to the client. We start working on it, and then the client sees his budget being spent on something that he thought was important, but is not as important as all the other stuff that's not going to happen because this is so much work. So we needed to add that decision. We had a retrospective, found that out, got the feedback from the client, and there another step in the evolution happened. Still makes sense, right? Then we have still the doing column, because nothing gets done if it doesn't get into doing at some point. And from there you can see much more detailed process of review and eventually putting stuff live. So that's the second line on the slide. It starts with, when you're done with something, you create a pull request and it needs to be reviewed. But we also found that there's some changes that don't come in through a pull request. For example, we make a design decision. Designer works on a new version of the PSD. That is not version controlled as the code is, but still this card needs to move through the process. So we have a peer review on the design. So the pull requests and the peer reviews come into the same column. It's the same process with different technology. So that's why the column got renamed. Then there is a reviewing column, because we found that if something is under review, you need to know that not another developer starts to review the same pull request, right? Another thing we learned in a retrospective, and you can avoid double work by adding another column to your Kanban flow. Then we found out that after reviewing it ourselves, we need to go to the client and put it into client review. Once the client is happy with it, we can decide that it's going to go in a release. So the client review happens on the develop branch, and based on the client review, either the pull request gets reverted, or we leave it in, and then we create a release branch using Git flow again, and we know all the stories to be released. Somebody needs to make the decision at some point after all the testing is done and we're all happy with the drop, that this thing is going to be merged into master. And then we found out that if you merge it into master, it doesn't get automatically deployed, right? We do have continuous delivery in place in many projects, but still you need to keep track of when this continuous delivery actually has run and whether or not it was successfully deployed to production. And then the final column is called live. So we got rid of the done state. Done is not clear enough, but we just put a live state there. That's the current status of the Startersquad flow in a few projects, few recent projects. But what we've seen as well is that there's a huge differentiation between organizations on how this flow looks exactly. So what we do is we have retrospectives with the developers where we learn from our own internal process and start doing things like renaming a column to from pull request to peer review. But we also have retrospectives with the clients where we find out that the client has a different kind of process. Some clients, for example, work with many different teams. They have different intermediate integration steps, and this needs to show up in your Kanban flow as well, but that doesn't apply to all the projects. So that's the evolutionary model of Startersquad has become quite detailed, actually, and we see a lot of different things happening on a lot of different organizations. And if you use a process like this, so weekly retrospectives, inspecting the flow, seeing where things are unclear, where you may need extra states, where you need to maybe rename states, you can actually let the flow, the genome of the flow, where you can let that adapt to the organization that it's in. So it's, I think it's a really interesting experiment to see how this genetic algorithm works on in different ecosystems. And I would warmly recommend you all to try it sometimes. So this is all I have in terms of slides, and I'm very interested in feedback and discussion.
Were you using any process metrics or feedback mechanism into your retrospectives?
Question?
Optimize your process.
The question is, do you use any process metric as a feedback into your retrospective? At Startersquad, we don't do Kanban really by the book, as I said in the beginning. So we don't measure lead times and stuff like that in a very disciplined way. But we do have some measurements. So we measure if we have a suspicion that something is wrong, like the lead time is too long or there is too much overhead in the project, then we put those metrics back into the system. But we measure them only on a per project basis if we feel that it's useful to measure them. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. You had a question as well.
How do you find that people pick up stories from one bit to the other? Because we had a similar process with Scrum, sort of, and we found that people got stuck. So even though we say everyone can pick up anything, a tester wouldn't necessarily take something from the grooming column and take it into the estimatable thing and actually work on it, because they left that mainly to the product owner type role.
Right. So
does any of your tasks struggle to move through this flow?
Yeah, so the question is about does the pull mechanism really work well? Do people pick up work without being assigned? I think that is not so much related to the flow itself as it is related to the mentality of the people working on the project. And what we have with Startersquad is that each client pays for each week, And every week, if they are not happy with the demo, they can ask for their money back for that week, or they can set a new budget. So if we don't deliver, the clients are not going to set extra budget. And this money that flows in from the clients is equally split between the team members. So if you look at your project flow and you see that you're not delivering a lot, you know that the client is not going to be happy, and you know that next week you're not going to get paid. So what we see happening is that if things get stuck on the board and somebody sees that, he knows that it is his bottom line at risk, and he starts pushing whoever he needs to push to make it happen. And
Effectively got instant autonomy and accountability.
yeah, instant autonomy and accountability, that's, I like that term. I will use it probably. And what you see also happening is that some clients, they don't know very much about the process, right? They don't know about the technical side of it. They don't know the Kanban process. They don't know how risky it is to have things stuck. They don't know how to make good specifications. And then if things get stuck in the beginning, and developers have nothing to do in the this week column or in the peer review column, they will move forward. They will call the client, and they will help him make the specifications. But that's related to intrinsic motivation more than the design of the process itself. Does that answer your question? Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Right at the beginning, the definition of evolution talked about three sorts of change, one of which was from simpler to more complex. I'm interested to know whether you've seen ever evolution taking the opposite direction of becoming simpler.
That's a really interesting question. Yes, the question is, evolution goes typically from simple to complex. But is it also happening that the evolution takes the other route, going from complex to simpler? Well, what you see is that in a genetic algorithm is very good at optimizing things. So if there is necessary complexity, this will grow naturally. But if there is unnecessary complexity in the process, this will get optimized out because people are lazy and people feel empowered to just delete one of the columns. Actually, there's one project where I'm the product owner, and one of the developers decided to just, remove the to be released column because we have continuous delivery in place, so it will be automatically released, right? And then I explained to him that I would like to have a staging environment where we can actually decide whether the release is ready and goes live, and we might want to automate that process, but I want to keep the column. But actually, as a product owner, I had to push back on the deletion of this column. So yes, indeed, we simplify. There was another question there. Yes.
What about relations between issues?
Relationships between issues.
What do you call them?
Yeah, so there's cards on the board. They might be user stories, or they might be tasks, or whatever you want to name them. They should be small. And the question is about what do you do with relationships between dependencies between the different tasks.
For example, you have a front end, but the API is not yet there in another technical component.
Yeah, so the example given is, let's say you have a front-end task and a back-end task, and they depend on each other. What we try to do is we try to define the features as user stories or job stories and make sure that they cover the full vertical slice. The thing cannot get done if not all the work is done, but we try to keep all the dependencies within the same card. So it's better to have a card saying, add check mark to this and this screen than to have build this and this screen, and then a separate backend card for it. So we make the card smaller, but we keep the vertical dependencies all in the same card. Sometimes you cannot get rid of dependencies, but then it's up to the developers to manage them well, and it causes problems indeed. He was first, sorry.
Yeah, because I was going to ask in relation to that, what if the combined card becomes so big that it doesn't fit in a single sprint anymore?
Yeah, if you have a combined card that gets so big that it doesn't fit in a single sprint anymore, well, it can happen in theory that, for example, you need to figure out a new algorithm to solve a TSP or something, but I find that in my career of well over 10 years doing software development, I've never really seen a task that was so complex that it couldn't be done in a few hours. The problem is that people try to piggyback all kinds of work onto the feature because they think they need to completely deliver a new version of the project. And if you if you're more humble as a developer and you think, okay, this is a very small thing I can do in a couple of hours and that's enough, and then I can take the next step, you will find that actually the progress speeds up. So you can always make it smaller, almost always. Your question.
You said that you keep features that are vertically, you slice basically the features across all layers of your project. So would this work in a team that, you know, the roles of the people are different? For example, this what you are doing assumes that all your developers are full stack developers, right?
Well, the question is, if you have vertical slices, you need multiple skill sets, obviously, to get the card done. And what if certain developers don't have all the skill sets to get it done, and there's no single developer that can get the whole card done? What we do is we have a quite strict rule about pair programming. There are not that many really strict rules in Startersquad because everything can be changed. But what we do is we pair program for more than 60% of the time, and the teams are all cross-functional teams. So the point is, if you need somebody else to get it done, you need to pull them in and you need to work together. That's a way better solution than to split the tasks up and basically throw them over the fence. It's one example for that is actually quite interesting. Is we say that for a card to be estimatable, it needs to be clearly defined how to test it. So the product owner needs to do his homework describing what the user expects, but the tester also needs to help the product owner to make it ready, because it will not get estimated if the tester doesn't say, okay, it works like this. And that you see lots of interesting collaboration going on by putting in just the right entry criteria for the lanes. There was another question over there, I think. Any more questions? Go ahead.
Just a small one. What tools are you using for the Kanban flows?
The question is, what tools do we use for Kanban?
Investigated a lot of tools, and I think that most of the time success depends on acceptability of the tooling for your team. So it's nice to have a good tool, but there are a lot to choose from.
Yeah, so how do you choose the right tool? Because the tool influences the success of the team and the success of your flow. What I found is that tools actually do not have this much impact on the success of the team as the culture and the definition of the flow itself. We tried indeed many tools. So we tried Jira, which is too heavy for us. We tried Pivotal, which is too opinionated for us. We tried Blossom, which is very nice, but for some reason it didn't get adoption. And we tried Trello, and Trello is so simple that it almost feels like stickies on the wall. And because it feels like stickies on the wall, everybody can use it, everybody can change the flow, and it just happens to work. But I feel that the process of defining the right flow and the culture around that is way more important than the tools. So developers should be able to switch tool in a day, and switching the process takes, you know, many weeks because we need to learn from it. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Talk in the industry about flow.
Mm-hmm.
How does this system enable flow within your teams to actually give the slack? So people like the Pomodoro technique, where you give the slack to people to have the time to take a break, and therefore you don't get bottlenecks turning up because you've actually got people basically doing nothing.
Yeah, so how do you introduce enough slack in the system to keep improving? Well, the way we do it is that we favor pair programming. So if you cannot find a pair body, that will give you some slack. Of course, you can start working alone on a feature, but it's much better to keep idling available for somebody else that might turn up after his lunch and continue on the feature with him. And while you're idling, you can do refactorings and you can look at the flow. Maybe you can improve that. So the way we do it is not exactly like Kanban describes it, because we use pair programming more as a mechanism than work in progress limits. But we do, as you can see on the doing, have a work in progress limit. But what I found with work in progress limits is actually quite interesting, that under pressure, people either don't respect them, or if the tool really enforces them, they start to make the issues bigger. So it has not the desired effects that you would expect if people would just, you know, really stick to them.
But isn't the desired effect that if you reach that limit, you actually start to think about how
Yeah, so the
Shouldn't that be a discussion in your retrospective then?
it has been, yeah. So the desired effect of work in progress limits is to make sure that there is slack and the system gets improved and the lead times go down. But under pressure, if there's a client that wants that feature and you're not allowed to move the feature into doing, young developers, they will just do it anyway. And sometimes it's actually better to just deliver the feature instead of bitching about the rules. So I'm not convinced that strict work in progress limits give the right behavior, and I'm not convinced that being very rigid about work in progress limits is actually a good thing. But you're right that in theory it should drive a certain behavior that is beneficial to the project, and that's a learning that we need to do. So we need to figure out what's the balance between breaking the rules and sticking to them, and it's actually quite hard. Does that answer the question, or?
Well, I just wonder what, I mean, it probably depends on the lifetime of a certain project, for instance, because it is basically meant to drive long-term process improvement. So if it's a short-term project, I can imagine that people, that you don't want to adhere to these rules because the lifetime for that single project is too short to actually improve that process far enough.
Yeah, so the improvement, as you describe it, would be on a single project, and then adhering to the rules will have a long-term benefit on the productivity on the project. And since with Startersquad, of course, we have short projects. We also have longer ones, like we had one running for a year. So that's, I think, very long for a project. 9 months should be the maximum, maybe. I know there are way longer projects, but that's not healthy, in my opinion. But what I see is that also the behavior that is related to sticking to work in progress limits, if you enforce it a little bit, that behavior will be reused on other projects as well, and then it takes much less time to get to this good, healthy flow of decreasing the lead times. So I try to push for it still, but there is big forces of nature at work that push you in a different direction. So I'm not convinced that you should be absolutely strict about it. But that's my opinion. Any more questions, remarks? Yeah, go ahead.
How big are your teams?
Good question. How big are the teams? I believe that a team should not be bigger than 7 people. Research has actually shown that the most effective teams are 4 people, and if you increase the size to 20, you get a productivity gain of 10% for the total team, so you pay 5 times as much and you get 10 times more productivity. Right now in Startersquad we have one team of 14 people with ad hoc sub-teams switching over the projects, and we're changing towards a model where people can be in different teams because you have certain kinds of specialisms that you need on all projects, and we're moving to a model where the teams are around 5 again, because we find that the 14 people team, even with ad hoc sub-teams and the soft splits that happen in such a team, are very hard to manage. Go ahead.
Yeah, how do you calculate the limits? Is it per team or per person?
How do you calculate the Yeah, I can explain it. I think it might be useful. So how do you calculate the work in progress limits? In a team, it is a good idea to force people to collaborate, and to force people that if they cannot collaborate, to make them not pick up new work, but try to improve the process or improve the code base by refactoring, for example. So if you have a team of 5 and the doing column has a work in progress limit of 6, then there will be one guy with 2 tasks and all the other ones will have a different task. That's too high. So my rule of thumb is make the work in progress limit for a doing column around half the team size. And that means if one of the stories gets blocked, it impacts everyone because you cannot pick up new work, and that forces the focus onto that blocked story. And if you make it higher, then you just, you lose one slot, but you didn't need it anyway. That answers the question?
Yes.
Cool. Any more questions? Remarks? Discussion? Good. Thank you. That was it then.